Ever get that feeling, when you hear a name like Linux tossed around, and it's like, yeah, it's a big deal, but the what and the why are kind of fuzzy.
Definitely. It's one of those things you hear everywhere, but might not fully grasp.
Exactly. So today we're doing a deep dive using that Wikipedia article on Linux as our jumping off point.
Should be interesting.
Totally. And one of the first things to know, Linux isn't just one thing. It's more like, imagine a huge family tree.
A whole ecosystem.
Right. You've got branches like Ubuntu over here, powering desktops, and way over there, Android, on like a billion phones.
It's that diversity that's really been key to Linux's success. Think like Legos versus a pre-built model.
I like that.
With Linux, you're not stuck with one way of doing things. That adaptability, super powerful.
It's like having a whole toolbox versus just one screwdriver. Right. Okay,
Yes.
so picture this. 1991, the internet's barely a thing.
Ancient history.
Haha, pretty much. Smartphones, still sci-fi. And Linus Torvalds, this Finnish student, he's wrestling with these clunky computer systems.
Back when proprietary systems were really the only game in town.
Expensive, limited.
Exactly.
And Linus, being Linus, thinks, why not build my own?
Boom, Linux is born.
Yeah. That's a classic underdog story.
David versus Goliath, but with lines of code as the slingshot.
And look at it now, powering everything from the servers running websites to those supercomputers doing like mind-blowing calculations. Even your smart TV probably has some Linux inside.
It's everywhere.
Speaking of how far it's come, there's this whole GNU Linux naming thing that trips people up. Why is that such a point of contention?
It boils down to, I think, acknowledging the foundations upon which Linux was built. The GNU project, spearheaded by Richard Stallman, they provided essential tools.
Like what kind of tools?
Compilers, libraries, you name it. Critical in actually making Linux a reality.
So it's like Linux is the amazing cake, but GNU provided a lot of the key ingredients.
Delicious analogy. And Stallman, through the Free Software Foundation, feels strongly about that contribution being recognized, hence GNU Linux.
Makes sense.
But it's bigger than just a name, right? The philosophy they champion, free software, it's not just about cost.
Right, there's free beer, and then there's...
Exactly. It's about the freedom to use, modify, share software, no restrictions. Revolutionary back then.
And still having huge ripple effects today on how we even think about tech.
Absolutely.
Okay, ready for a quick tour of where Linux is found today? Because, wow, does it get around. Servers, we covered that. Smartphones, check, thanks to Android. But hold on, because it also powers spacecraft.
Systems where reliability and performance are non-negotiable.
No room for error up there.
Exactly. And speaking of performance, did you know even Hollywood relies on Linux?
Wait, really?
Yeah. Blockbuster movies like Titanic, all those groundbreaking visual effects, Linux was behind a lot of that rendering power.
Mind blown.
It's true.
Okay, brace yourself for some numbers that really put this into perspective. Studies in the early 2000s analyzed the sheer size of Linux. We're talking millions of lines of code.
Massive undertaking.
They estimated if you tried to develop something comparable commercially.
The cost would be astronomical. Billions with a B.
Wow.
That's the power of open source. A global community contributing to this shared resource.
Which, speaking of which, makes the whole story about the Linux trademark even wilder.
Oh, you mean the laundry detergent debacle?
Wait, what?
Yeah, someone tried to trademark Linux for, get this, cleaning products.
You're kidding?
Nope. Imagine that. Yeah, I use Linux to stream movies, control my smart home, and oh yeah, it's a brand of laundry detergent.
That's hilarious and kind of terrifying.
Thankfully, common sense and trademark law prevailed. Linus Torvalds actually holds the trademark now.
Good. But it makes you wonder.
Right.
Even with something as seemingly like ubiquitous as Linux, there are these fascinating stories beneath the surface. So far, we've covered the history, the impact, even almost having our laundry done by it. But what about the actual tech? What's going on under the hood of a Linux system?
Ah, and that's where things get really interesting. Let's unpack some of those key components because that's what gives you a feel for its power and flexibility. So you want to get under the hood a bit, see what makes Linux tick.
Exactly. We've talked about like the impact, the history, all that. But now I'm kind of ready to get my hands dirty, metaphorically speaking.
Well, remember how Linux got its start? Linus Torvalds, he was initially building on a system called Minix.
Right, another operating system. It's kind of like using one set of tools to build an even better set of tools.
Exactly. Now, Minix, it was freely available, but the licensing was kind of restrictive. You couldn't just modify it and redistribute it willy-nilly like you can with Linux.
So that freedom was a key difference right from the start.
Absolutely. That's the beauty of the GNU General Public License that Linux uses. Anyone can use, adapt, share the core of Linux, what we call the kernel, without all those limitations you get with proprietary software.
And that's why we have this whole smorgasbord, this like buffet of Linux flavors.
All those different distributions, yeah,
Yeah.
they all stem from that freedom.
Okay, so we've got the kernel. That's the heart of it all. But there's got to be more to it, right? What else is in this delicious tech cake we keep mentioning?
Remember those key ingredients from the GNU project? This is where they come in. We're talking core utilities, the GNU-C library, compilers, even the bash shell, which a lot of people use to interact with Linux through text commands.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that. It's not all just clicking icons. There's like a whole command line world under there.
For those who want it, absolutely. And all these components, they work together, along with the kernel, to make a fully functional system. It's a symphony of open source collaboration.
It's kind of beautiful when you think about it like that. And speaking of getting things done, you mentioned servers, smartphones, even spacecraft running on Linux. Where else does this versatile OS pop up?
It's practically everywhere these days, honestly, especially in what we call embedded systems.
Embedded systems. Give me a for instance.
Think your router, the unsung hero directing traffic on your home network. Or automation controls in factories, smart thermostats,
Or
even those fancy in-flight entertainment systems on airplanes.
wait, so Linux is like basically flying me to my next vacation. I never would have guessed.
It's a testament to its reliability and efficiency. You wouldn't want your in-flight movie cutting out mid-flight, would you?
Definitely not. And speaking of high-performance situations, you mentioned supercomputers earlier. Why is Linux so dominant in that world?
It comes down to a few key things. First, efficiency. The Linux kernel is incredibly streamlined, optimized to squeeze every ounce of performance out of the hardware.
So speed is key when you're like crunching massive data sets and stuff.
Absolutely. But it's not just raw speed either. Linux is also highly scalable. Imagine a supercomputer with thousands of processors all working together. Linux excels at managing and coordinating these crazy complex systems without breaking a sweat.
It's like the conductor of a very, very powerful orchestra.
A very apt analogy. And let's not forget the scientific community. They were early adopters of Linux, drawn to its power for handling vast data sets and running complex simulations. It's fascinating to think that a system born from this student's desire for a better computing experience is now driving cutting-edge research.
That is wild. Okay, so with Linux being open and customizable, how does one actually get started with it? I can't just go buy a box copy at the store, right?
You're right. It's not like your typical off-the-shelf operating system. This is where those Linux distributions come in.
So these distributions are like what, curated Linux starter packs?
That's a great way to put it. Instead of wrestling with raw code, you get the Linux kernel, those essential GNU components we talked about, plus other pre-selected software, all nicely packaged for easy installation.
So it's less build it yourself, more pick your favorite flavor.
Exactly. And that's where Ubuntu, Fedora, all those names come in.
So each one is catering to a different kind of user.
Precisely. Ubuntu, for example, known for being super user-friendly, big software library, makes it a great choice if you're coming from, say, Windows or macOS.
Like dipping your toes in the Linux pool.
Exactly. Then you have things like Fedora, often favored by developers, system administrators, folks who want the latest and greatest software, even if it's a little less polished.
So it's about finding the right balance for your comfort level and what you actually need to do.
Exactly. And the beauty is, with so much variety out there, there really is a Linux flavor for everyone, from casual users to hardcore techies who live in the command line.
Okay, one last thing that's been on my mind. We've talked about how Linux is free to use, modify, share, which is amazing. But who's funding all this development if they're not selling software licenses? How does that work?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It gets to the heart of how the open source model even functions. And while a lot of individual developers contribute their time and skills just because they believe in it, there's also a surprising amount of corporate support for Linux.
Wait, really? Big companies are investing in something they can't directly profit from.
It might seem counterintuitive, but yes, companies like Google, Samsung, Intel, even Microsoft contributes to Linux development.
Microsoft? But isn't Linux a competitor to their whole Windows thing?
In some ways, sure. But even Microsoft has recognized the value of Linux. It's a robust, reliable platform for their cloud services, for example.
So it's if you can't beat them, join them.
Kind of. It's a testament to how this open source model can foster collaboration, even among companies that, yeah, might be rivals in other areas.
And it's that mix, right? The individual passion and the corporate backing that keeps the whole Linux train moving forward.
Exactly.
It's pretty inspiring when you think about it. We started with this student project back in '91, and now it's this global phenomenon powering like everything, supercomputers, smartphones, you name it, all driven by this worldwide community.
And honestly,
Yeah.
we've only scratched the surface. Linux is constantly evolving. New distributions, applications, use cases popping up all the time.
So if you're even a little bit intrigued by all this, I highly recommend checking out that Wikipedia article we used as our guide. It's a great place to start digging deeper.
Absolutely. And the most exciting thing about all this is, who knows what incredible things will come out of the world of Linux in the years to come. It's a really exciting time to be paying attention.
That's it for our deep dive into the world of Linux. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration of the tech world. Until then, keep on learning, keep on exploring, and keep on questioning.